Welcome to this introduction to embedded signing using PHP and Dropbox Sign. Organizations use Dropbox Sign to streamline their approval processes and to help them store legally binding digital records of their contracts. Today, we'll walk through how an HR tech company can enhance its talent contracting and onboarding processes by implementing e-signatures with PHP. For instance, if you're working at a talent contracting firm where volume recruiting and onboarding contractors is an essential process, an in-house solution for document signing would be really helpful. By embedding signing into your contracting workflows, you're able to eliminate painful tasks through automation and digitization, like chasing down paperwork and manual in-person signing. In this scenario, you could create a base system that lets the HR team upload documents to a dashboard where they can then request a signature from a new hire or supply one. Then, the new hire could preview a signature request and read the attached document right from their dashboard. The only feature left would be to implement and enable the new hires to actually sign the documents. In this tutorial, I'll show you, the developer wanting to implement embedded signing, how to easily construct a signature request using Dropbox Sign's PHP SDK and then embed a signing flow into your application. Before you begin, you'll need PHP 8.1 or newer, Git, MySQL 5.7 or newer, and Composer 2.3 or newer. You can find the links to download all of these tools in the video description below. To make this tutorial a little easier, I'll be using a web application that's available in the GitHub repository we've linked to in the description. The demo app is built using Laravel and provides authentication functionalities that mimic an authenticated user. It also allows for basic user registration and profile editing, and it has a simple dashboard where the HR team can upload documents to be signed or reviewed. To get started, I'll go ahead and clone the repo. The main branch of the repo contains the final code. The starter code is in a branch named Basic. So, I'll switch to the Basic branch and install both the PHP and JavaScript dependencies. Next, I'll create a .env file from the existing .env.example file and create an app key. The app key is a random string used for cryptographic operations, and it helps keep your application secure. Now that I have my app key, I need to set up the database for the application. I'll create a user named Documenter that will manage the database named DocumenterDB. I'm going to log in as the root user and run a few commands to set up the database. Keep in mind that these commands may be slightly different based on what versions of MySQL you're using. The first command will create the database. Then, I'll create the user. I made the user password simply password. But for a production application, make sure you use something more secure. The database is ready, and the user is ready. It's time to give the user permissions for the database, which I'll do now. To connect the application to the database, I'll replace the database environment variables in the .env file. These are the variables that let me connect to the database. Now the DB connection is MySQL and DB host is set to my local host. The DB port is set to 3306, which are the default values for MySQL. I'll change the DB database to my Documenter DB, the username to Documenter, and add the password, which is password. Now that my database configuration is set, it's time to run the app's migrations and seeders. The command I'm using creates 8 tables. I'll log into the database to show the tables that were just created. The most notable are users, document types, signatories, and signature requests. At this point, I could run the application and make it accessible in my browser, but the web application depends on both PHP and Node.js. That means I need to run servers for both of them. I'll start by running the PHP server in a terminal at the root of my project directory. Then, in a different terminal, I'll run the Node.js server. The application will be served on localhost at port 8000. When I open the URL in the browser, it looks like this. As part of the migration seeding, a default user was created in the database named documenter@yopmail.com with 123456 as the password. I'll be able to log directly into the application's dashboard using these details. To use the API, I'll need a Dropbox Sign account, my API key, and client ID. I've already signed up for a free trial and followed the steps to complete my first document signing request. To create an API key from my dashboard, I'll click on API. Then I'll click Generate Key, and I'll be asked to define the name of the key I want to create. I'm going to name it Documenter. Then I'll click Generate Key, and a new API key will appear on my dashboard. After I save the API key in a safe place, I need to get the client ID for the applications, which means I need to create an API app. To create the app, I'll click on Create App, then fill out the form's General Information section, giving it a name and setting the domain field to the app's top-level domain. I'll use example.com as the top-level domain. This information will be used in production for signing requests, but it won't affect anything in development. The other sections are optional, so I'll skip them for now. Once I click Create Application, I'll be given a client ID. I'll copy the client ID and store it in a safe place. Now that I've created the API app, I'll need to add the Dropbox Sign PHP SDK to my application using Composer. I'll stop the PHP server and use the composer require command in a terminal at the root of my project directory. This downloads and adds the Dropbox Sign SDK to my application and resolves and installs all its dependencies. My output looks like this. Now, I need to create two environment variables in the .env file to hold my API key and client ID. This is recommended to avoid exposing them by embedding them directly in my code. I'll open the .env file and add the first variable like this. Now place an equal sign and paste my API key. In the next line, I'll do the same thing for the second variable. I'll name it ds_client_id, add an equal sign, and paste the second key. If you're following along, don't forget, you'll need to replace the text after the equal sign with your client ID. Now you're ready to include Dropbox Sign's embedded signing functionality into your PHP application. When it comes to requesting signatures, I have a few options. My first option is to simply sign into my application and select the files that need to be signed. Then Dropbox Sign automatically creates a new page with fields for the signatures I've specified. My second option, which is a better fit for scenarios that require a specific structure or wording like a standard engagement contract, I can define templates with custom fields for variable information like the person's name, position, and salary. But if I have a document that is going to change based on the context, like with an internal memo, I can use the File and Form Fields option. In this scenario, I would provide a list of the fields and their coordinates when sending a request via an API. For simplicity's sake, I'll use the Files method. But before I can create my first signature request, I need to add some code to the signature request controller.php file, which can be found under app/http/controllers. The create signature request form has already been created in the resources/views/signature requests/create.blade.php file. The information from the form will be passed to this controller. I'll add this code to the top of the signature request controller.php file beneath the existing imports. This imports the various classes from the SDK that I'll be using to interact with the Dropbox Sign API. Next, I'll add a function for making an API call to create my embedded signature request. All the user-submitted information will be extracted into two variables and passed on to the function. The parties who need to sign are extracted into the signatories array and the rest of the form values in the signature request object. This method sets the configuration for the SDK using the DS API key environment variable I recently added. The configuration creates a signature request API object, which will be used later to make the API request. From the signers array, an array of sub-signature request signer objects are created that can be passed to the SDK. The behavior of the signing process is now defined, which means the new hire can now draw, type, or upload their signature. An object is created to hold the body of the request, and the title, subject, and message are set. These details are used to send email notifications to the CC'd email addresses included in the embedded request. Generally, embedded workflows don't provide email notifications to the signers. However, by including the CC email addresses parameter, notifications of the final signed document will be sent to those emails included in the request. Here, the legal team is CC'd. The files or documents to be signed are attached using the setFiles method, which accepts an array. However, here I'm only submitting a single file. Finally, in the try-catch block, the API request is made to Dropbox Sign, and the response is returned. If an error occurs, it will be caught and returned to the catch block. Now I need to call this function in the part of my application that handles the form processing. In other words, the store function. Right before the signature request signatories save many signatories line, I'll paste this code. This makes sure that the results are a valid response obtained from the API and extracts the signature request ID to be stored as a reference ID. The respective signature IDs of each signer are obtained and stored in the database. I can use these later to check the status of a signature request or download a signed file. After this, I'll log into my application and submit a signature request form. First, I'll restart the PHP server. Then, I'll click on the Create Signature Request and give the request a title and a description. I'll add a document and select the document type. Then I'll add a signatory. Finally, I'll click on Create Signature Request again. Now, if I go to my dashboard, I should see the signature request. And if the request is successful, I'll see it in my Dropbox Sign dashboard. As you can see, I have one pending signature. If I click on that, I can see all the requests made via the API or on the platform. The next step is to use the signature ID of each signer to obtain a temporary unique URL that allows them to sign the document. But before I can generate a sign URL, I need to know the user's signature ID. This is returned as part of the response when I make an embedded signature request. The show method of the signature request controller.php file handles all HTTP requests to view the details of a specific signature request in this application. The ID specified through the URL fetches that signature request record from the database, which in turn is used to populate the front end. I'll paste this snippet right before the return statement of the show method. This snippet initializes the SDK as an embedded API object. If the current user is recognized as a signatory on the request, their signature ID is extracted and used to obtain a sign URL for that signature request. The URL string is then passed to the front end to be used later. Now is the time to create a front-end JavaScript library, but how I do this depends on what front-end technologies I'm using for my application. I can use Dropbox Sign's front-end library through npm, a CDN, or through GitHub as a script. Here, I'll download the plugin from the releases section of the GitHub repo to the public directory in the root of the project directory. Next, I'll open the resources/views/signature requests/show.blade.php file, which contains the code that shows the details of a single signature request. I'll paste this snippet at the bottom of the file right before the closing X-app layout tag. This snippet declares and assigns the client ID you obtained earlier, as well as the sign URL provided from the backend. A simple sign doc function is defined. It initializes the hello sign library with the URL. A few parameters are also passed, including the client ID. I'm also configuring the library to skip domain verification and enable test mode, since this is a test scenario. Keep in mind that if you're testing on a domain that's different from the domain assigned to the client ID, you'll have to skip domain verification when testing. Now I'll add a Sign Document button to the page by pasting this code right before the Back button. Take note that this button only appears if the user is a signatory on the current document being viewed. To test this out, I'll first log out of the Docs admin, and I'll register a new user, which will be our new hire. I'll use the same email that I used to create the signatory in my signature request form, and then a password and confirm that password. Then I'll click on Register. As you can see, this shows me the document that I need to sign. When I click on View, I can see the document in the document viewer. Once a user, in this scenario a new hire, clicks Sign Document like this, they'll see a model containing an iframe with the document to sign. Since I'm working with a free account in test mode, I'll receive a notice that this document is not legally binding. I'll sign the document, just like the new hire would, and click on Insert and then Continue. When I click on I agree, I've officially submitted the document as the new hire and I can close it. If I go back to my Dropbox Sign dashboard, I'll be able to see I now have one signed document, and I can preview it and see the new signature has been inserted. Now that I've walked through the document signing within a PHP application, let's quickly review a few things you'll need to do to get your application ready for production. Make sure you check the status of a signature request. Can you download signed documents from Dropbox Sign? You may need to implement certain actions depending on specific user events during the signing process. Also, make sure that you check out all the client-side events for Dropbox Sign's JavaScript plugin or the complete set of options to customize the plugin. You may also have noticed a disclaimer after you generated your client ID earlier. Before you can go live, Dropbox Sign needs to first approve your application to ensure it complies with e-signature regulatory policies. After approval, make sure that your application is hosted on a registered domain owned by your organization, complete with SSL certificates. Additionally, make sure that you're on the correct Dropbox Sign API plan. Embedded workflows start at the standard API plan level. Then you're ready to go live with your application. If you want to see more examples of embedded signing with Dropbox Sign, check out our embedded signing documentation. You can find the link in our resources section below. Happy coding!